Welcome to the Fantasy Champions Fantasy Football Podcast. Here's your host, Morgan Colby and Rick Lemon.
What's going on, Fantasy Champs?
What's poppin'?
What's crack-a-lackin'? Should be an interesting show for you. Trade targets as we enter into week 8 of the NFL season. We got to improve those teams a little bit.
Yeah, you might be sitting there 2-5, 1-6, 3-4.
0-7, dare I say?
If you're 0-7, I have a feeling you're probably not watching this show.
You're absolutely cooked. Yeah,
I think you might have either checked.
I think it's week 10 that the numbers start dropping off. People,
I know.
You know, I'm done with
the people
fantasy.
who are in it just check out.
Just check out. Yeah. So we are going to try to help you with our week 8 buys and sells and some trade targets that you should have. Usually these carry in week over week. Like Adam Thielen, still a sell. That guy off your team. Sell that dead weight. He'll probably go
get 40 this week.
Yeah, watch him to get 40. But yeah, so we're going to do our buys and sells. Before we do that, check out our website, fantasychampions.com. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and any other podcasting platforms, please leave a review. Share this podcast with your friends. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe. Click the bell for notifications, like and comment down below. All right, let's jump into those buys and sells real quick and get cooking.
Okay, cooking.
Number 1 on the buy list this week, so we'll start with all 3 of our buys, is Bijan, whatever. I don't know. Is it Bijan? Because I always get roasted in the comments for saying it wrong.
Okay, well then maybe I think it's Bijan.
Bijan, whatever. It's Robinson, a running back.
The Falcons one.
The Falcons one. One of the Robinsons we're going to be talking about today. Sneak peek. So yeah, Bijan Robinson is he's ridiculous if we're being real. Like I've really never seen a running back like Robinson. I'm trying not to be hot takey, but some of the stuff he does, like I talked about this before, like in Madden, it's not real life. So some of the moves they make look a little bit ridiculous.
Yeah.
Running backs, if you put jukebox on, like some of the moves they make, in the NFL, you never see players make moves like that. It's just like fake. He looks like a video game running back. Like he just jukes and people fall on the ground. He did one-handed catches. He's done the works. He's ridiculous. He's absolutely freaking absurd as a running back. And Arthur Smith's a dink. So I want to start with that. You loser Arthur Smith. You fake coach that's never going to be good. Can't stand Arthur Smith. He's going to have to use him eventually because the team is going to be like, listen, we spent a lot of draft capital on Robinson. You kind of have to play him. After this week's debacle. And he's getting in trouble with the league because of that, which is hilarious, by the way. But Bijan Robinson is a great trade target. He had 0.3 fantasy points last week. Didn't play a whole ton. And I think a lot of people are looking at the backfield and they're frustrated. Aljair is getting a lot of unnecessary work. And Bijan is, he's getting a lot of fantasy points. He's getting a lot of work on top of that, but you feel like he could get more, even on top of what he's doing. And I think right now, because he scored 0.3 fantasy points, it's a little bit on the lower side in terms of what people think of Robinson. And you might be able to go to the person that has him and say, hey, I want Bijan Robinson on my fantasy team. Before this game, he had 20, 21, 10, 18, 11, 13 before he scored basically 0. He's still a top 10 running back, even though he scored basically 0 this week. So I think Robinson is a guy you need to try to trade for, and if you have an opportunity to jump on that and try to trade for him, you might be getting a top 6 or 7 running back in fantasy football. Or you are getting a top 6 or 7 running back in fantasy football. Rick, I can't hear you, boss.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Were you muted?
Yeah.
How did you mute yourself?
I sneezed and I muted myself. I forgot to unmute.
Oh, all right. I'm like, this guy has not been talking at all.
No, so it's funny, but I do agree with you. And I think people before this past week were kind of not necessarily getting sick of Bijan, but kind of waiting for another big game because he hasn't really had one since week 2. He's been consistently solid, but hasn't had like that big 20+ point week.
Yeah.
Since week 2, and then he had this week. So I think you can definitely get him. I mean, he's still not going to be cheap, but he's definitely available in your league. And if you're able to get him, I think he's one of these guys that, second half of the season, he has a couple tough games, but overall, like Tennessee is kind of tough, kind of. Minnesota, Arizona, Saints and Jets and Bucks are not great, but then his playoff schedules, Panthers, Colts, and Bears, which is all green matchups. So I think his best days of the season is yet to come.
Yeah.
I think rest of the season he could, as you said, like top 6 or 7. I absolutely think he could do that. He's top 10 right now, even with the really bad week. So I would hop on any train to try to get Bijan right now.
Yeah, I totally agree. He's an absolute freaking stud, and I think he's like he is starting to have one of those seasons. If he starts getting back to the big games like Saquon did his first year, I don't know if he can be RB1 though. Yeah, it's probably out of the realm of outcomes.
No, I think it might be too late for RB1.
Yeah, but he's still really good. So
he could be RB like 4 though, RB5 if he finishes the year really strong.
Yeah, for sure. All right. What about the next guy, Rick, on the buys list?
Next guy is your guy, actually, Brandon Aiyuk.
My dog.
Brandon Aiyuk has been very solid all season. I think this week we were expecting a little bit more, and I think most people who had Brandon Aiyuk might have been expecting more. It was a great matchup against Minnesota, no Deebo Samuel. He only had 10 points, but he's still, man, when you watch the 49ers play, like, he's really good. He's just a straight-up really good player. I think he's gotten better as he's been in the NFL. He's now 25. It feels like he's kind of in the prime, entering the prime of his career. And it shows. Like, he really is one of the best route runners. And he gets open all the time. Bar Purdy just needs to freaking hit him some weeks. And, maybe the matchup thing isn't always consistent. Like, Pittsburgh has an average matchup, and he put up 32 in week 1. Arizona is a good matchup. He put up 20, but like Cleveland is a really tough matchup. He had 11, and then Minnesota was an easier matchup. He had 10. So I don't know if it's necessarily matchup related with him. So I would buy him. I feel like he is due. Like he hasn't scored a touchdown since week 1. He is due to have like a multiple touchdown game or like a big monster like 25, 30 point week.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to come sooner rather than later.
Yeah, the other thing I would note too is after the bye week, like Cincinnati's a tougher matchup this week, but after the bye week, he's got Jacksonville, Tampa Bay, Seattle, Philadelphia, Seattle, Arizona, Baltimore, and Washington. So there is some easy matchups in that stretch of games, preferably the Seattle twice and Arizona. Jacksonville's been a little bit tougher this year, but and Washington is just a freaking cakewalk in the fantasy championship.
That's that championship week too.
So he's
20.
I think like at this point in the season, we're almost halfway through. Aiyuk has been really good. He's wide receiver 18. He's already missed a full week against the Giants. Didn't play that week. So, he'd probably be somewhere in the top 10 at the wide receiver position had he played that week. Like Rick said, he hasn't had a huge game, but you have to start thinking about at this point in the year some of the playoff schedules that you're going to run into. And with Arizona, Baltimore, Washington as his playoff schedule, that if he's available to play and he's not obviously injured, God forbid, that is a really good playoff schedule, something that you can rely upon, something that you can look forward to if you're going to the playoffs. So if you're starting to think about what you won a bunch of games, you're making trades, and Aiyuk is kind of underperformed a little bit, and maybe the person that has him is like, I need more, and you have the ability to make a trade, go and make that trade for Brandon Aiyuk, and then you can set yourself up not just for the second half of the season to get some wins, but also for the playoffs a little bit with that easy schedule. I think those are the benefits of getting Brandon Aiyuk at this point.
Agreed.
All right, let's talk about the next guy, which is Christopher Godwin. I think at some point this has to flip. At some point, Mike Evans has got to stop friggin' ripping people's drawers off and scoring a ton of fantasy points. Now, he hasn't been fantastic, I'll say that. But it's got to flip a little bit to Chris Godwin at some point. He's wide receiver 38. He's had 10, 10, 8, 19, 13, and 12 so far this year. But he's still getting a pretty decent target share. And he just hasn't scored a touchdown. He hasn't put together a week where, like, you talk about getting 10, 10, 8, 19, 13, and 12 and not scoring a touchdown. That's pretty good.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
That's pretty good. And if the touchdowns start coming for Chris Godwin, like they start getting into the red zone and throwing it to Chris Godwin, and in the second half of the season, he catches 4, 5, 6 touchdowns in the back half, he's going to have some really big performances. And you're going to wish you had Chris Godwin at that point in the year. So he's been consistently okay. He's a guy that you can pick up, I would say, on the cheap and get him on your team. And he provides you with a decent target share. He can be your first or second flex and provide really good fantasy production. And I've noticed with Chris Godwin, it usually takes him into the second half of the season to really fully get going anyway. So there could be a situation where he goes off, but Chris Godwin is definitely a buy at this point.
Yeah, I would agree. And the touchdown thing is legit. I mean, he did only have 3 touchdowns last year, so I'm not expecting him to start getting a touchdown every week, but he is still due. I mean, no touchdowns, and he's, like you said, he's been pretty decent without the touchdowns. He's still a startable flex every single week. He puts up double-digit fantasy points. Mm-hmm. He's not going to be expensive to get. He's had this, he has the same amount of targets this year as Mike Evans.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy?
They literally have the exact same amount of targets.
Mike Evans is just scoring
catches.
Mike Evans is
Mike
just
Evans
has
more yards, more touchdowns, and more big plays, which at the end of the day, that's what matters you for fantasy. Yep. We are recording this before the Thursday night game, like an hour before the game. So maybe he tears his ACL or he scores like 50 fantasy points. So
yeah, don't trade for him if that happens.
Yeah, but I still do like Godwin rest of the season. Not just the fact that he's due, but even when he's not scoring touchdowns, he'll still be solid for you. And then if he starts scoring touchdowns, you're gonna fleece whoever you made the deal with.
Oh, for sure. And I don't know if Baker's going to get any better in the second half of the season, but I think that there's definitely an opportunity for more than 3 touchdowns like last year. He's just not a red zone target. He's a guy that when you get into the low area red zone that you can kind of, maybe throw a zig or an out route to, which is where he gets most of his touchdowns. But like Mike Evans is the big play receiver. Godwin's the slot receiver. So that usually doesn't work out for guys trying to catch touchdowns. All right, let's go to the sells. Now this one's interesting. Rick might have some disagreements on it, but number 1 for me is Joshua Jacobs. And listen, I like Josh Jacobs. I don't think he's a bad player to have on your team. I really don't. Like, if you want to roll with Josh Jacobs the rest of the season, you want to keep that guy as a top 10 running back, you don't have any interest or see a need in trading Josh Jacobs, then you totally are fine. Because he's still running back 11 on the season, and he has the potential to have some really big weeks. The other plus of him is that in the second half of the season, there are some easier games that he can kind of play with. He has the Chargers, he has Minnesota, he has Miami, the Jets, the Giants. So those should be Indianapolis week 17. So those should be some games where
the Bears though.
Yeah, he did play the Bears and get 5 points. But that was probably the worst game I've seen the Raiders play all year. So maybe that had an effect. I don't know, but he has been getting a majority of the work. So there's some benefits to keeping Josh Jacobs if you want to keep him. My thing is that with Josh Jacobs, he's 5th in red zone scoring. He's only scored 2 touchdowns. They're giving him a crap load of work and he's not performing. He has 2.9 yards per carry on the season. His efficiency through the air hasn't been great. He has been getting targeted a lot. So for PPR, that's where a lot of his early season numbers have come from, are catches and receiving yards.
Yeah.
Which is good. But I think unless he starts scoring touchdowns like he did last year, that's been the difference. He has 2 touchdowns this year. Last year at this point in the season, he had a total of 7 touchdowns. Or 6 or 7 touchdowns. So,
yeah.
like 2 touchdowns in 7 games over, 6 touchdowns in 7 games is a huge difference. And if he had scored 3 more touchdowns, I think we would be talking about Josh Jacobs being in the top 5 or 6. So he's still getting used. But I don't know if the touchdown thing is going to change because I think the Raiders offense is just not good. Like even when they have, everyone's like, oh, Jimmy's coming back. Who cares? Like they still suck. It's still not good. Now Jim might be better than Brian Hoyer was this week.
Was better.
That was
Brian Hoyer threw 2 interceptions and like 150 yards.
Yeah, he was awful. So like they could improve, but my thing is that like I think that Josh Jacobs carries name value. He's still a top 11 running back in fantasy football. So when people look at his numbers and people look at him as a player, they're going to be like, okay, he's a top 12 running back. So you probably can still get something good for him. And if you can improve your team at this point in the year, because if you're a Josh Jacobs owner, you're probably 500 like myself. And you're probably in a range where you're like, okay, this guy's been good for me, but he hasn't been performing. And if there's other areas on your team that you maybe can improve upon using Josh Jacobs, then I would do that. I'd take that opportunity. If you feel like you're comfortable sitting where you are, and maybe you drafted a really good team and you're 5-2 or 6-1 or whatever, and you've had a really good season so far, and you have Josh Jacobs, then it's fine to hold him as well and wait it out because I don't think he sucks. I don't think he's going to be like horrible rest of season, but it is disconcerting that he's just not scoring touchdowns, and even with the opportunities that he has gotten, he has been freaking crazy inefficient. So it's just going to be tough. And then this upcoming week, he has the Detroit Lions, who are one of the best run defenses in the NFL right now, and they're angry. And they're probably going to try to destroy and rip the pants off the Raiders. And if he has another bad week this week, the wheels could fall off, and not the wheels could fall off on his season because I think he's got a couple of easy matchups following that, but it's going to get harder to sell him. You know what I mean? And so you're going to have to hold on to him for longer in order to maybe even have a chance at getting value back. And by that point, most of your bye week, most of your trade deadlines will have happened. So I think if you're going to sell him, it's like this, even after the 5-point game against Chicago, like this is probably the week that you got to do it.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree. I think it's a tough time to sell him. What you said about the touchdowns though is true, and I would take it with like his efficiency too. Like he's at 2.94 yards per carry right now. That is brutally bad. And I don't know, like I think it'll get better because that's just so bad. And with Garoppolo playing, like I think you can be a little more efficient, but like I don't think he averaged 4.8 yards per carry last year. I don't think that's happening again. I think he goes back down to like 4 yards a carry, and when he was doing that, he was RB11 in 2021. So like I still think he's like looking at the rest of season rankings on Fantasy Pros, they have him at 11. They do have Barkley behind him, which I would switch that for sure. But like I don't really like he's probably RB12 rest of season.
Yeah.
Maybe you can make the argument RB13.
If he starts scoring touchdowns, I could see him easily jumping up on the rest of the season like quickly.
Yeah, and he could. So like I don't know. I think it's just a tough time to sell him, but I wouldn't begrudge you for doing it because I don't think the Raiders offense is getting a whole lot better. And even though he does have some good matchups coming up, he's had good like the Bears game should have been a game where he played well and he just didn't. So it's hard to trust him. So I wouldn't hate on you for keeping him. I wouldn't hate on you for trading him, but this was a year pick. So
yeah. Hey, I'm
and
starting
he's
to
guy too. He's on your face.
I love him. Yeah. I'm starting to be done though. All right, number 2, Bijan Robinson. He's one spot ahead of Joshua Jacobs. Interesting things with Bijan Robinson. Interesting. So he has 4 rushing touchdowns on the year, right? Yeah. And 2 receiving touchdowns. So he has
complete opposite.
He has 6 touchdowns on the season. His fantasy point totals weeks 1 and 2 were 13 and 28. Yeah, that's 28. 13 and 28. And then he had a bad game against Buffalo, 7. And then Philly, he had 13. Chicago, he had 8. Atlanta, he had 13. And then the Giants, he had 8. The interesting thing is that since week 3, He has had 37% snap percentage, 55% snap percentage, 36% snap percentage, 55% snap, 53% snap percentage, and then 49% snap percentage. And his totals rushing wise went from 19 and 18 rushes to 10, 14, 6, 10, and 8. And he doesn't really get a whole ton of pass catching opportunity. I think he has like over the last 4 weeks or 3 weeks, he has like 7 targets. So that's not brutally awful. He had one target with one game with 4 targets, but he's just not a pass catching running back, and he's not going to be prolific or efficient in that area enough for you to rely on him. In PPR formats, if he's scoring touchdowns and he's getting 18 rushing opportunities, then he's fine. But he's definitely one of those guys that you're starting to see a trend where he's falling off a little bit. And he's not getting as much snap percentage. He's not getting as much work as he was. And because of that, it's trending for me in the wrong direction for him, where he's going to be a guy that gets around 7, 8, 9, 10 fantasy points, as opposed to what he was early in the season where he was around 14 to 20 fantasy points. I don't think he's going to hold that, kind of total for the rest of the season. I think he's going to be more around 8 or 9. And so the production that you got out of him early in the season is really good. But if there's a team that really believes in Bijan Robinson and really believes that he is a top 12 running back in fantasy football, he's actually RB12. I was wrong on those numbers. But if you're able to trade him away and get something for him based on his early season performance, I would do it like instantly. Otherwise, Bijan Robinson on your team is not going to be a good look.
Yeah, I mean, we know guys in our league that value him as a top 12 guy, so they're out there. There's probably a lot of them, and I don't think Bijan Robinson's bad because he is the goal line back, and he is the lead back in that backfield. Gibson is pretty much dead. He gets like 5 touches a game. But the thing is, like, he doesn't have the passing game, and if they don't score any touchdowns or they don't have a lot of goal line opportunities, which happens with the Commanders because they're a very inconsistent team, he's not going to put up a lot of big weeks. I think what he's been doing, so he had the 28-point week in week 2.
Yeah. Which
I think has boosted his numbers because outside of that, like what he's done since then, the 7, 13, 8, 13, 8, that feels more like what he is.
Yeah.
Where he can still get you a decent week. He can still get you 13, 14 points, gets a rushing touchdown. But similar to Jacobs, he's not efficient, but he also plays in an offense where he's not the pass catching back either. At least Jacobs has the pass catching. So with Robinson, a lot of people do view him as that top 12 guy. I think you and I view him more of a low-end RB2 flex play sort of guy. So there's a big value difference there. And I think if you can sell him to one of those teams that believes he's a top 12 guy, do it.
Yeah, I agree. All right, final guy, number 3, Christian Kirk. Actually been really good on the season. Actually he has a lot of targets. He's right around 55 targets on the season, which how many games have they played? 7 games. I'm trying to figure out what that average is. Let me just do some math. If my
That's
notifications,
like 120. Quick math.
Oh, whoa! Quick math.
What is it?
7.8 targets per game times 17 games is 133 targets.
Oh, I was off. Wow.
So he's on pace kind of for what he did last year, the exact number of targets he had last year. So he's been putting up numbers. He's been good. And once again, they get Calvin Ridley and you think Calvin Ridley's the guy. And I still think he is.
Week 1.
I still think he is. But Christian Kirk is still this guy. Like you come into the season and you don't think he's going to be good, and then all of a sudden he's good, and that's what happened last year.
Going into the year, thought he was okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a bad player, but like you thought all the targets were going to go to Calvin Ridley, so he wasn't going to be as good. But he's been pretty good on the season. From week 1 on, 1, 21, 15, 16, 14, 13, and 19 in PPR. So he's been consistent. He is a wide receiver 15 on the season so far.
That's a top 10 guy since week 2.
Yeah, top 10 guy since week 2. So he's been really good. I mean, I don't dislike the production from Christian Kirk, but I will say I do think the bye week's coming up, and I do think at some point they're paying Calvin Ridley more money. He's the wide receiver one. Like, he's the dude for them. And I think that the target share will flip. I think it's going to end up at some point in the season being Calvin Ridley, and Christian Kirk is going to be the guy that you can probably deal. If he continues to have production, then that's fine. But I would take the numbers that he has put up since week 2, put those together, go to somebody that needs a wide receiver and say, hey, listen, this is your dude. Take Christian Kirk. If you need a running back, go find a running back, or whatever you need. But if you got Christian Kirk, you probably didn't draft him to start on your team. So,
or he was your flex probably,
right?
Or your bench.
Exactly. So it's like he's not a linchpin to your operation unless your team is really bad and you drafted poorly, and Christian Kirk's the only guy that you got that's good. But chances are he's just a little plus for you to have. And I take players like this and I flip them for better players. So guys with more name value, guys that are going to produce on a week-to-week basis, this might be a fad stretch of games where he doesn't continue to have the success that he has had. And it could be just a mirage. So just take that and sell it. Christian Kirk is not going to be a super valuable sell. And if he has 2 bad weeks, all of a sudden, all of that value that you thought you had is vanished. So that is why I would trade Christian Kirk. I think there's a chance that he could continue just doing what he's doing, but there is also a stretch at the end of the season that's very tough. So it could go negative.
Yeah. And I'm okay with keeping Kirk. I think he's still going to be a solid flex.
Yeah.
Rest of season. But he's more inconsistent than I think the numbers have shown.
Yeah.
Because statistically, he's been great and been very consistent. But his target share is kind of all over. Like, he had 14 and 6, then 12, 8, and then 6 and 6. So, like, there's some weeks where he does get the double-digit targets and is the focal point of the offense. But then there's some weeks where he's not, but he's just efficient with the targets that he gets. And I think at some point, he's going to stop being super efficient in the weeks where he gets, like, the 5-6 target mark.
Yeah.
And he's going to put up some stinkers. And at that point, you're not going to be able to trade him for the value that you can right now. Because, again, kind of like Bijan Robinson, I don't know if you could sell Christian Kirk as a top 12 guy, but you could probably sell him as a top 15 guy for sure.
Certainly.
And I don't think he's going to finish top 15. Again, I still like Kirk. I think he's a good flex and will probably finish, maybe like 20 to 24, maybe around 20. And I think that's decent. And he's still going to have some decent weeks because I think the Jaguars offense is really good. He's their slot receiver. He's kind of at times Trevor Lawrence's security blanket. Like, he goes in a lot on third down. So there's a lot to like with Christian Kirk. It's just, I don't think the explosion is quite there, like with Calvin Ridley. Like, the 21-point mark, which he got in week 2, I feel like is his ceiling.
Yeah.
With a guy like Ridley, he could have a game where he gets 160 yards and 2 touchdowns.
For sure.
So with Kirk, you kind of get what you get with these weeks, and at some point he's going to have the week where he gets the 6 targets, 3 catches like he did against the Colts, but he doesn't get the touchdown, and he gets like 6 fantasy points.
Yeah, and I think he's one of those, like, not, like I said, it's not really like a super surprise considering what happened last year, because if Calvin Ridley was never here, this would be happening, and it would be expected because Calvin Ridley was never here. Calvin Ridley not producing for a little while here has caused that. But I think, like I said, my big thing is not necessarily that Christian Kirk sucks or that he's going to be bad. It's more or less the fact that I think at some point the target share will shift in Calvin Ridley's direction, because I think the talent and the player ability is there. And when the connection starts to get better between him and Trevor Lawrence, then I think that there will be benefits to that. And Calvin Ridley has far more name value than Christian Kirk does. So you have to sell Christian Kirk off his production. And if he has 1 or 2 bad games, then you're screwed. You can't sell him. So when you have an asset that's outperforming, which I think he's outperforming right now, you kind of have to sell him. That's what I would do. That's just my fantasy advice to you. But any more thoughts?
No, I think that's it.
Okay, there you go. Trade targets in the books for week 8. Hopefully you enjoy this weekend and get a fantasy dub. Hopefully I get a fantasy dub. My gosh, I've been waiting for it. It's been 3 weeks in my home league. I can't do it anymore. Enjoy your weekend, guys. Enjoy football. See you later.
See ya.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Champions Podcast. Make sure you subscribe on iTunes and YouTube and follow us on Twitter @TheFFChamps.